É grande prazer de iniciar o segundo webinário sobre este grande
So
tema,
hello to
sobre
everybody. It's a great pleasure to open the second seminar about environmental risks
através de uma abordagem realmente
and
colaborativa
culture.
que está feita
And
com
this is through
atores locais
an
e
approach that was very collaborative with
no
the
papel
help of
de patrimônio cultural
regional organizations
em
with a focus on
quando
cultural
o
heritage.
patrimônio cultural está ameaçado pelas mudanças
And
climáticas,
we wanted to look at how much
mudanças no
cultural
meio
heritage is
ambiente,
threatened
quanto o
by
papel que
these risks to the
os
environment
patrimônios
and
culturais, a arte e cultura, que papel de arte e cultura
the
neste
role.
contexto.
What is the role of art and culture
Então, é
in the
grande
climate
prazer que a
crisis?
gente tem como
It's a
parceiro
great
nestes
pleasure to
webinários o
be able to
FRPC.
introduce our
Ele
partners
está no
here.
segundo hoje e vai terminar no final de maio com
And
grande
we're
seminário
on our
para
second
pessoas
seminar
ligadas
here,
em
and we're going to
Rio
finish at the end of May with a
para
huge
participar
seminar in Rio.
seminário presencial na Fundação no
It's going to
Memorial
be
de
an
Getúlio
in-person
Vargas.
event in
Mas
the
até
Memorial Getúlio
entre
Vargas in the
eventos
city.
nós temos 4
But
webinários que
until
todo
then,
mundo
we've
pode
got
participar
4 webinars
para compartilhar projetos do mundo inteiro.
to share with you
Este
projects
programa que
from
é
the whole
apoiado
world.
pelo Ministério de Cultura do
This
Reino Unido
program
e
is
japonês e
supported by the Culture
Ciência de
Ministry from the
Artes
UK
de Pesquisa de Arte
and the
Humanas
Arts and Humanities Research
inglês,
Council in the UK
apoiando
as
9
well.
projetos no mundo inteiro,
And they
pensando sobre
support
este tema. A gente
projects around the
aconteceu
whole
durante
of the world
3
thinking about
anos
this
e a gente tem
specific
grande prazer
subject.
de compartilhar
And it's a
metodologias
great
que
pleasure to be
estão
able to
sendo desenvolvendo em
share
várias
these
partes do
projects
mundo.
with you.
Nosso objetivo é que essas metodologias possam
Our
ser
aim is for their
pensadas
methodologies,
contempladas aqui no Brasil e
that
qualquer
their
pessoa que quer
methodologies are
seguir com
shared
essas ideias, se você
around the
está
world.
escutando uma coisa hoje e você pensando, nossa, isso tem um
And
eco em nosso
sometimes if you hear
bairro, a
something
gente pode
today that
pensar
resonates with
sobre
something
essa
that you're doing,
metodologia aqui
with
no
work that
Brasil,
you've heard about,
então
then you can
fale com a
ask
gente.
about the
Eu
work that's
sou Paul
happening.
Heritage, sou diretor de People's Palace Projects e vocês
I'm Paul
têm nossos
Heritage. I'm the
contatos. A
director
gente
of People's
quer
Palace
mesmo
Projects. You've
criar
got
mais
our
diálogo
contact,
e mais
and
colaboração neste grande
we'd like
tema.
to
Hoje, quem vai
have more
conduzir
partners and more
este
collaborators
debate,
in this
este webinário,
huge
é nossa
project.
companheira
So
Fabiana. Fabiana,
today,
passo para você. Bom
I'm going
webinário
to
para
ask
todos.
Fabiana to explain what today's webinar
Thank
is
you,
about.
Paul. I'll be speaking in English today, but so I would like to welcome everyone, especially our guests. It's a pleasure to have you both here, Dr. Alan Forrest and Julian Jansen. I'll make a brief introduction and then we can start the presentation. So Dr. Forrest focuses on the sustainable use of plant resources across the Middle East and has managed research, conservation, and sustainable use programs across Arabia and in Afghanistan and Central Asia. Alongside with Dr. Jansen van Rensburg, I think, and a team of Soqotri partners, established the Soqotra Heritage Project in 2017 and has managed the project logistics alongside research, training, and advice on the sustainable use and planning of heritage management on Soqotra. His ongoing research includes incorporating sustainable resource management and heritage components into protected area systems and management with a focus on local engagement and ownership. And that's the project we're going to hear about today, the project on the Soqotra. So now Dr. Julian Jansen is the global leading expert on the cultural heritage of Soqotra, with over 20 years experience researching the island's heritage in all its form. His research interests include cultural heritage management, rock art, GIS applications in archaeology, maritime archaeology and ethnography, landscapes archaeology, island and coastal archaeology, as well as Indian Ocean trade networks in antiquity and the Islamic period. So very excited because we're going to be hearing all about the cultural heritage and the concerns they have in Soqotra about how
Fabiana,
climate change. Yes.
I think we have problems with the simultaneous translation. So can we just check that it is actually working?
Really?
Yeah, it seems to be coming and going. I don't know if just a slight technical hitch here. We'll get this sorted.
Oh,
Igor,
no.
can you let us know that if it's working? Parece que a gente tem problema com tradução simultânea, mas a gente vai resolver logo, com certeza. E por enquanto, não vou passar, a gente não vai passar para Alan e Julian por enquanto, porque a gente quer ouvir tudo que eles estão falando. Mas tomara que...
So we're going to just check. We have some technical problems with apparently. So we're just waiting to make sure that that's all working properly, and then we will ask you to speak then. So, but I think so they've worked for more than 2 decades looking at these issues on the island of Soqotra, and his dedication goes way beyond culture, and everybody who is involved in this type of research is that the research is always collaborative, and as well as that, it's a commitment to objectives that go beyond meeting the
yes, I think we're
needs
back.
of
We've got
finance.
We're back. We've got the translation going, so I think we can start. So yeah, on to you, Dr. Alan. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk a little bit about Soqotra in a Brazilian and in a global context and audience. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you a little bit about Soqotra, for those of you who may not know where it is or anything about it. I'll talk to you a little bit about the features of the island, and then my colleague Julian will introduce you to the extremely varied cultural heritage that exists there. And then we'll talk about the approaches our project has taken and the ongoing collaborations we've established there. I cannot see the slides I am presenting, but should I ask for each slide to move forwards?
Yes, please. Sorry. Just say present the slide and we'll start.
There we go. No, I can see everything now. That's perfect. That's the introductory slide, which gives you a little glimpse into some of the physical heritage on Soqotra. So yes, please move to the second slide. So I'm just going to start by telling you where Soqotra is. If you look at this map, you see the Arabian Peninsula, and in the southwest you will see Yemen, of course, currently in a state of conflict. And to the south of Yemen you will see a small island called Soqotra. It's actually an archipelago. The main island of Soqotra and 3 smaller islands and a couple of sea stacks form the entire area. It's around 3,600 square kilometers in total. It's sometimes referred to as the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean. Now, everyone has heard of the Galapagos. I hope that some people in the audience have heard of Charles Darwin, very, very famous evolutionary biologist. Unfortunately, he didn't visit Soqotra. However, a nice gentleman called Isaac Bailey Balfour did visit Soqotra. He visited in 1880. He was a Scottish botanist, and he undertook the first botanical survey of the island of Soqotra, which was incredible. He described more than 250 new species of plants. But he didn't really write much about evolution like Darwin did, so he's not quite as famous, unfortunately. You have to go looking for places like Soqotra, and once you come across them, you kind of fall in love with them a little bit and want to help the communities there protect the incredible and unique heritage they've got. Unfortunately, the main problem with Soqotra is that it has received a lot of funding to protect its biodiversity and has been designated a World Heritage Site because of it. But up until very recently, very little was known about its cultural heritage, and there were no funding programs or no major research programs on the cultural heritage of Soqotra. So thank you for moving to that next slide. This is a map of the island. It's incredibly diverse. It is topographically diverse. Mountains up to 1,600 meters, a complex climate system, a very arid island, but with intense rainfall at times, a unique language, a population around 60,000 people at the moment. It's been an island for perhaps 18 to 20 million years. So although a continental island, it's been isolated for a long time, long enough to develop some very, very unique characteristics. You can still match the north coast of Soqotra to parts of the south coast of the Arabian Peninsula to see where it used to sit before the Gulf of Aden opened up in geological history. It's been isolated a long time. Next slide, please. I'm just going to run you through a few images to give you an idea of the astonishing features and landscapes and the habitats of the island as an introduction. This is the Hagaha Mountains in the center of Soqotra, and in the foreground the endemic and quite unique form of the dragon's blood tree. It really is a symbol of the island, the dragon's blood tree, but of course it is a tree, so it gets on the nerves of archaeologists because all we seem to talk about are the famous dragon's blood trees. But of course there is a lot of traditional knowledge associated with them also, which is part of the heritage of the island. Next slide, please. So extensive cliff systems leading down to wide coral and sand coastal plains, warm and rich subtropical waters, a very different type of environment, and also quite an arid environment. Next slide, please. This is a landform on the small island off the coast of Soqotra main island. So the geologically complex and very, very diverse landscapes. Right on the top of that landform, you can see actually a tree, which gives you some sort of idea of the scale of some of the features of the islands. And we'll come back to some of those unique trees in a moment. Next slide, please. So again, the Hagaha Mountains in the background, and in the foreground, the globally unique dragon's blood tree forest. No other species of dragon's blood tree on the earth forms woodlands the same way that this species does. It's not just a unique and endemic tree, it's a unique environment, and one that people have relied upon for many thousands of years since people were there, I guess. Julian will correct me if I'm wrong. Next slide, please. And that's just a brief insight into the unique growth form of this tree. People have said it looks a little bit like an upside down umbrella, but you can tell how old the tree is by the interesting and intricate branching problems. And many of these trees, in fact, are very old, and very few seedlings, a common problem globally. I think that also applies to the island of Soqotra. Next slide, please. And just to give a brief insight into the diversity of the endemic plants, many more than 300 now described. Many tree trunks that store water in an arid environment. The desert rose on the top left, what's known as the cucumber tree top right, the only tree in an entire family of plants that contains only climbers and smaller plants. Some of the unique floral forms of the island, and it's not just plants, of course. Almost all of the reptiles of Soqotra, about 30 of them, are endemic. several birds, the majority of insects and mollusks. There is an incredible array of endemic biodiversity in the habitats of Soqotra, and that is why it was recognized as a World Heritage Site and inscribed on the World Heritage List in 2008. Next slide, please. And as a result of its uniqueness for biodiversity, it has many, many designations, lines drawn on maps. A World Heritage Site, Manon Biosphere Reserve. You can see them listed here. In terms of heritage, when we started our program in 2017, there was basically no cultural heritage infrastructure on Soqotra. There were no designated sites. There had been no funding to build up the management and the capacity of local people to recognize, document and protect their cultural heritage in all its forms. And that really was the basis of the start of our program. Next slide, please. And just a note that when we talk about cultural heritage and biodiversity on Soqotra, we recognize that those two things are dealt with separately in what you might call first world or global north scientific principles. We like to treat these as two separate things. On Soqotra, that doesn't really work. To separate biodiversity and traditional knowledge and heritage, it's just life on Soqotra. One survives by using what is available to hand. And in this unique publication, The Ethnoflora of Soqotra, of the 850 plants that grow there, there are uses documented for 750 and more of them. The people of Soqotra are very, very good at recognizing local tools to hand and finding out what they can use for in their day-to-day lives. And their language evolved in a great part to recognize and describe that range of biodiversity. Next slide, please. So as I alluded to previously, what of cultural heritage? What of archaeology? What about traditions? What about knowledge, music, language? Why have these things not been documented and funded and conserved in the same way that biodiversity has? Why have we not recognized how these things work together? How all these things work together in a future threatened by climate change, extreme weather, and a whole range of other threats? And that really is the key question in many areas. I would like now, with this lack of funding for cultural heritage on Soqotra, just hand over to my colleague Julian, who will tell you really about the diversity of the cultural heritage that we find there.
Thank you, Alan. I think it's quite clear before we go to that next slide. It's very clear that on Soqotra, everyone's been going on about the plants, and like most people, I went to the island, saw some plants, kicked a few rocks around, and said, "Oh, actually, these rocks are much more interesting than those strange plants." Of course, we all go to see the strange plants. So for the past 20 odd years, I've been trying to say to people, actually, there are people here, and I think that comes out clearly. Just what Alan showed you now. Not one of those pictures he showed you has a person in it now, or even part of a person in it. So it's just a plant. And unfortunately, that's what people who are going to Soqotra see, plants. And I'm sure there are very many correlations you can draw with the Amazon. People go there to see plants, to see animals, and then that's it. So what I'd like to do is just quickly show you a couple of pictures. We'll go to the next slide. And what you'll see on the next slide is just some work that was undertaken. It looks a bit strange. There's the island, and all those little black marks on the island are actually walls. So what this is demonstrating, and when we started mapping the walls and getting a better feel, what this demonstrates clearly is that people were doing something on the island, and doing a lot of things on the island, and as you can see, all over the island. So yes, there were people there, and yes, they still are people there, and yes, they are exploiting this island. It's not a bucolic Eden that nobody is in. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see what I mean. You have these just slightly extant walls here going off. And this is what we call like a droveway, or where people would have sort of herded cattle along, just along the island, and pointing things out. So it's quite interesting. You get the sort of idea of separating the island, of creating pathways through the island, and a lot of this relates to management of plants, management of soil, management of water. And as we sort of try to understand these walls, and we're getting there, we're realizing that back in the day, at least about 1,000, the first century, 2,000 years now, the first century AD, Soqotra was very well known, and it was being heavily exploited for frankincense, for dragon's blood, and for aloes later, and that. So it's always had these markers in the landscape telling us that, hey, wait a minute, there are people here, and these people are exploiting the environment. They're using the environment. The fact that you have this lovely island that everyone goes to see the plants is because of the people. Next slide. So as you'll see here, again, this is a bit more modern, these walls going through. This is, again, these so-called walls of the island are on as many different places as the plants are. This is up in the Hagia Mountains, where over 1,000 meters above sea level. And again, it looks like a meandering wall, and at the moment we're not that clear, but when we start looking closer at these walls, we realize that it's not only one function, and we don't know exactly when they were built, but we are quite clear that they served several functions. As I mentioned, soil retention. When it rains heavily, which it does quite often, these walls stop the soil disappearing. And again, the same things with water. Some of them retain water or act as what we call check dams. So it slows the water down so that water spreads further along, so that you can water a bigger area. If we go to the next slide. Now, I know I keep going on about water, but as Alan said, this is an arid island. And yes, it does have a monsoon, and yes, it does rain a lot, but a lot of this water is gone. It goes either into aquifers or goes out to sea. So you have wadi systems, which are perennial water systems that just wash out to sea, and then that water's gone. So what the locals have done over centuries, and this is a good example of, we call them on Soqotra leams, which basically is a type of dam. So this is a natural area on the island that sort of where water would come. They use these walls to divert water to these areas, and then at times they will re-dig them to make sure that this water stays there. And throughout the island you find these leams. Sadly, a lot of these leams are slowly becoming left, left alone, that people are not utilizing more for various other reasons due to modernity and whatnot. But next to this leam, you can actually see on the, my right, your left potentially, is a series of structures that we are starting to look at. And it's going back several hundred years, if not later. And we are seeing, again, people sort of trying to get together, utilizing the areas of water, which are imperative on Soqotra. Water is key for sustaining livestock as well as sustaining their own people, especially during the diet periods. So these leams are scattered all over the island, mostly for livestock and for livestock nowadays, but but if we want to look a little bit deeper and we want to see that as far as Soqotra, we always sort of see Soqotra as being an island, and islands are notoriously for being isolated. So if we go to the next slide, excuse me, we come across one of probably the most famous sites on Soqotra. It's a place called Hock Cave, and in Hock Cave, we have from the at least, 1st century BC right through to the 6th century AD, a series of, as you can read here, scripts that India, South Arabia, Ethiopia, Mediterranean, and further south and further north. So what you can see is that Soqotra is definitely not isolated. In fact, it's very, very well connected. In fact, when you look at all these walls on the island, it actually says, wait a minute, we've got a lot of people on the island doing a lot of things to supply these people who are coming here on their boats with products of the island. These natural, everyone now is flying to Soqotri. They're being supplied, they're being gathered, they're being harvested, gathered, and then they're being sold. And here we have some quite clear evidence of some of the sort of what's going on the island. If we go to the next slide, what we see again here of more of these inscriptions, and in fact this wooden tablet that was found on the island, which is from Palmyra, and it is basically, it says, I was here at this date exactly, and at this time everything was great, and when I came to the island we met these great guys and everything was in this thing, and we have a type of deity in this cave, and please leave my please leave this tablet in the island. Essentially, in a nutshell, what these inscriptions are telling us is that people were going into the cave, and only these Indian and other foreign traders were going into the cave and writing their names on. Whether this was graffiti, although we think now because you're going 5 kilometers into a cave just under to write your name, it probably had another meaning as well. But essentially they were going in there to sort of say, thank you, I got to Soqotra, it was difficult, I'm going to write my name, I was here, and thank gods or deities who were there. So if we go a little bit to the next slide, I'll show you something else that's also. So what we have here are what we call petroglyphs, and it's just a script. And actually what's quite interesting about the script is that it's got correlations with a script that was found in Dhofar, which is in Oman, which is just to the northeast of the island. And these correlations, again, are showing us, while we haven't quite dated or actually got the script translated yet, it still hasn't been done. There's still these correlations, and again, it just shows you that this island was not isolated. It was a hub of activity. There were people coming in and coming out. We're not looking at a bunch of local people who never saw anyone else, who were living in an island with lots of lovely plants and just caring after the plants. These people were engaged in exploiting the plants, using the plants, engaged in overseas trade, bringing people back and forth, exchanging ideas, social ideas, political ideas. They had all of this stuff. So it's just some of the things people are unaware of. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that unfortunately some of these sites as well, because they're not recognized as such, and this is a classic case. It's the site of Eriosh, a very important rock art site, which is probably the biggest rock art site on Soqotra, which sadly still has not been recorded in its entirety. And just to make matters better, just when there was a road built near there, and the road was heading towards a nature reserve, and they decided in their wisdom that they'll stop this road from going into the nature reserve. Great idea. What did they do? They built this road over the rock art site. So in the distance you see a car, and basically that's the one edge of the rock art site, and they built a road across it. So we've lost part of the rock art site because it's not, nobody was looking at cultural heritage on Soqotra. And that seems to be a theme that goes through the entire conservation strategies on Soqotra up until quite recently. So if we go to the next slide. So we'll just have a look at another island, another cave, sorry. This is a cave called Dahasi Cave, which has been recently. And what's particularly interesting about this cave, besides the Christian imagery, which I can answer questions about that, but if you look carefully, you'll see all these little outlines, and they're like squares. And I believe part of these squares are related to the outside landscape, because if you go outside the cave, you will see these walls, and the walls are at a push similar to what you see in the cave. So it's quite possible that you have some sort of ideas of what was going on in the cave. They were coming there. There was some maybe religious or otherwise political thing. and dividing up the outside landscape, and then inscribing that this is mine, this is yours. There's another thing here I'll just point out to you, is the sort of little horned man, if you want, for a better word. And this sort of animistic representation of a horned man is, we believe, is something to do with sort of the livestock on the island, the sort of goat on the island. We're not sure exactly how long it's been there, but it has this, within recent belief systems, and also generally for farmers, the goat is actually quite regarded as an important animal. If your goats, they have many stories and songs and things about goats, it's quite clear. And it may be that this have been earlier, much earlier, part of a deity, wearing goat's horns and things like that. We see this in other areas of the world. And, we just start to get a flavor of the people in this on this island. So if we go to the next slide. So what we'll see here is a person. Actually, this is school children that we took out to one of the sites. And on these inscriptions that you're seeing in front of you, you can still visit, is actually much more modern, 17th century inscriptions by Gujarati sailors, telling you how many people came to the island, how many were sailors, how many were soldiers, and what they were sort of doing on the island. And the scary part about this is that people had no idea they were there. A few tourists would visit it. It's actually blocked off. So when we took the school children over there to show them their heritage, they were like, wow, this is ours. Where did this come from? It's like, no, it's here. It's part of your heritage. And this is something that's been constantly going through. So if we go to the next slide, we can see another site here, in fact, two sites, just rather large. So the biggest site that you see in the foreground is supposedly a trading post dated to around the 1st century again. And it's believed that this site is where they would collected all the frankincense and whatnot and sent it out on shipping, which is just here, it's literally maybe half a kilometer away from the coastline. There's some doubts about that, but that's an archaeological question. The other side is inland, and again, you can sort of see how these sort of sites, and there's archaeology there, there's people there are things happening on the island. There's just nobody there now. So if we go to the next slide. So yeah, what I also did on the island is we went and undertook an ancient DNA project, and we looked inside these burial caves, which are spread throughout the island. And within these burial caves, many of them looted. It seems to be quite a thing on Soqotra, I suppose, like many other places on the world. We were able to collect some samples from ones that weren't too looted. Obviously, this went through an ethics thing, and I can go into detail about the ethics and explain to you how this project worked later. But essentially, we collected samples from these, obviously the full consent and whatnot. And then what we found was 1,000 years of history of the people that are living on Soqotra. To be published, it's coming up shortly, but I'll move on to the next slide and just give you sort of some flavors of more of the sort of tangible bits. Again, it's on the south coast. Originally, it was believed on the south coast that it was completely uninhabited. It's dry. There's very little water during most of the year, except for during sometimes the monsoon season, but it's a sandy plain. Things get washed away. We started looking, and it's like, no, people were living here. So if we go to the next slide, you see this is a very, so we have what these sort of dolmen. I'm sure many of you may be aware of what dolmen are, essentially these, and it's potentially a burial. But again, a lot of them, a few people have seen them. They're sort of, oh, it's just stones. We're not sure what it is. And it was a bit like, wait a minute, this is actually showing at a prehistoric people. This is going even further back. How far back are we going now? So in a nutshell, we have a very ancient population. And this population is also erecting stone structures like this, and similar to what you see on the mainland, again, demonstrating this connectivity. So what I'd like to do now is, having given you a quick rundown of what we see as a sort of tangible heritage, I'd like to just jump into the intangible heritage to show you that I am a jack of all trades. I've done tangible and intangible. So in the next slide, what you'll see here is, as part of many of these projects, especially recently, we've also looked at sort of intangible heritage. Now, as Alan said, Soqotri is its own language. It's one of 6 languages, and probably the one with the more it's what they call a modern South Arabian language, but it doesn't mean modern. It's an ancient South Arabian language. Again, I can explain that more in detail. However, what's very important with the Soqotri language is that it's still spoken, although admittedly nowadays the youngsters, they are less fluent in the language. There's less people learning it, and it's probably, like many of these languages, it will eventually die out unless plans are made to encourage people to speak it. And that is sort of what we've also encouraged by holding festivals, which I'll get to in a minute. On top of that, we have local song and dance, music, dance, all these things. But what's very interesting here, I just want to draw your attention to, is the poetry. Quite often in England and other places, poetry is considered to be a bunch of people sitting in a room enjoying each other's poetry and saying nice things about flowers. On Soqotra, poetry is quite different. It's very much about saying love and other things, but it's also very much a bit of it, look at us, we're better than you, our poetry is better than you, this guy is better than you. And it can also put a lot of other things in. So actually it becomes quite competitive. And it's very interesting to be at one of these poetry competitions, because you tend to get a lot of, you get groups of poets sort of vying for Poet of the Year, and it's extremely interesting, and it gets quite heated at points. Obviously all done in poetry, and it's really a pleasure to sit and listen to. And things like games and these other competitions, these were never recorded for. Literally, the idea that they played games has been recorded by us 2 years ago, I think it was now. Otherwise, no one had realized or bothered recording them. The locals said, yes, of course we play games. So it's like, but you're supposed to be herders looking at sheep. No, we play games. We've got this game. You want to come play? We have this brilliant game. So the whole point of this is a lot of what's gone on in the past has not really looked at what's actually happening locally. They don't want to bother to ask people, what do you do? What are the materials you use? What sort of knowledge do you have other than the knowledge related to plants, which is what everyone's sort of interested in? So what sort of practices? And then when you start asking about natural resources, you start to see they're also doing like these soul turns. But these people have been and still are exploiting and utilizing the landscape. The landscape is dynamic and it's being used by people. I'll keep on going on about this for a while. If we can go to the next slide, it just gives you a flavor of the sort of poets. On the bottom right or left, as you can see, is the youngest poet of the year, and all of these poets that you see here, sadly not all of them are with us today. Phenomenal poets, and they come to our poetry competitions and they vie for Poet of the Year, and they receive the accolade of being Poet of the Year, and that's about all they receive. It's fantastic. They really bring to light all the old practices. They talk about the times, and they bring the old stories that relate to part of their historical traditions, stories that relate to what's going on in the environment. So a lot of these poems that have been recorded, and Miranda Morris has a lovely book that I suggest anyone interested in poetry lay your hands on, and they just go through. So you can learn so much about the people, their traditions, their beliefs, and all that just through their poetry, which is constantly going on. And I'm not saying it's not evolving, it is evolving, but it has these elements of what was going on in society and what is going on in society. So if we go to the next slide. Another thing on Soqotra, as I mentioned, the goats, and yes, the goats are also used for meat and milk, but also for making these Soqotri carpets. And believe it or not, but in the 13th century, these carpets were one of the major exports on Soqotri. And these carpets are all made on what we call a loom here, or these floor looms. And yes, they're still making them, as you can see in the image here, to this day. And it's extremely interesting. There's ways of making it, and we slowly documented it, just to give it sort of flavor of what's going on. Yeah, it's just one of these traditions that has just been slowly ignored, and sadly, as is always the case, the lack of a market for them, which we are trying to address in our project as well, has causing fewer and fewer people. Young people don't want to be involved in this labor, and slowly we're trying to re-encourage that before the older people with this knowledge essentially die. So if we go to the next slide. As I mentioned, a lot of what goes on the island is that they utilize these trees, and of course the famous dragon blood tree. You can see the resin in front of you and how they use it on pottery. They also use it in history. They were using it for preventing blood flow. They've used it for Stradivari violin. On the island, they use it like one would use rouge or nail varnish. And if you heat this up, it will stain extremely. You won't get it off your hands for a while. It's obviously when they paint it on the pots like this. So it has many uses again, but these plants are sustainably harvested every year. They'll get together, look at a section of dragon trees and say, okay, we can cut this one. You cut it like this, and this is what you do when you cut it. And there's a specific rule of thumb how to do this. So again, you see that they're actually utilizing these plants. So if you go to the next slide, I think, Alan, you're taking over, yeah? Or shall I deal with this?
No, I shall happily deal with this one. Thank you very much. I'll just to reiterate what Julian highlighted and why we sometimes call Socotra the Galapagos of the Indian Ocean, is that idea that an island is an isolated system in terms of evolution, and we can look at it on its own to see how evolution has worked. And it's actually when you start looking, as Julian says, at the people and the heritage, you realize that islands really aren't isolated in the same way when you think beyond biodiversity. It's also true in modern society that one of our main methods to protect biodiversity and increasingly cultural heritage is through protected areas systems. And when we make protected area systems in continental areas, what we're doing is making islands, and therefore the way we look at actual islands versus protected area islands, they become similar to each other, and what we learn from one we can apply to the other. And that interconnection between those islands and other places also applies. And that exchange of ideas is something I'll come back to in a minute. But as Julian's also highlighted, we established this project so that a local people could document and learn about heritage that at times, he said, the young people weren't really aware of, and now they are far more aware of it. And as an extension to that project, we started to look at whether climate change was actually threatening parts of this cultural heritage and what methods we could use. And actually the question was, is there traditional knowledge on Socotra that actually is applicable to coping with a changing climate, because it already has a changing climate. And what do we need to do? How do we need to approach helping the local people on Socotra to adapt in different ways? As you can see here, the climate of Socotra, like the island itself, is complex. It is not just one monsoon each year as you get in other tropical and subtropical areas. It has a twin monsoon. It's a complex system where the two monsoons operate almost entirely independently from a climatic point of view. But actually, when you see patterns in one monsoon, they're often replicated in the other. If the rains fail in May, they're often weak or failing later in the year as well. And when the rains fail in 2 times in a year, you really have a serious drought on your hands. And the droughts are so bad that the locals, they live in community memory with specific names. The year that all the goats died, this type of thing also relates to poetry. In fact, the way they describe what has happened in the past. So we took a number of different approaches, and just to highlight some of the, I mean, these 2 images you see here on the next slide. Sorry, if you could show the next slide. What you have here is a photo taken in, I believe, the 70s, maybe the early 1980s, of a village on the north coast of Soqotra, and then an image taken within the last few years that to be moved, because the increasing severity of the effect of the sea and along the coastline were just leading to constant floods, constant problems. The entire village was shifted inland as a direct result of a changing climate. If we go to the next slide, please, you can see there's a common theme of water I'm trying to bring out here. This is the main road from the capital of Soqotra, Hadibo, to the airport. It's quite an important lifeline. It's also the road that goes beyond the airport to the second major city on the island. This is what happens when you get extreme weather events. The flooding is incredible, and there's no infrastructure to deal with it at all. It'll have a major impact on daily life, and for long periods of time on the island. Next slide, please. Just to quickly highlight how extreme weather events and changing climates can have a direct effect on built heritage, about which we know virtually nothing on Soqotra. It's been an area of research that really hasn't got started yet, and this has actually been going on for a while. Some of these first damages to built heritage were recorded decades ago, but in the last 5 to 10 years they've had some quite devastating effects, not just in coastal areas either. The tropical storms and cyclones have damaged the infrastructure on Soqotra significantly, but some of the historical components have been particularly badly affected. Next slide, please. Despite the fact that we have this twin monsoon system and all this rain, it's quite sporadic, it varies a lot, and despite this system, water availability is the big issue on Soqotra, and obviously is closely related to the climate regime of the island and of the region. We really, it used to be the case that water was managed in the way that Julian describes, through the wall systems, streams, and in some other ways with ancient water held in cave systems and coming out of springs that were really probably came directly from the cave systems out of the limestone cliffs. Nowadays, people are just piping water and building these delightful looking concrete water tanks. I'm not aware that anyone's tested the quality of water in these tanks. It doesn't look great visually. And there have been examples of people falling into these tanks and actually drowning. That shouldn't happen in funded development programs, in my opinion. But it is difficult to argue that supplying communities with water supplies is a bad thing, but it can be done badly. And on Soqotra, we believe a lack of taking account of the climate and the water sources in planning has potentially ignoring traditional ways of doing this in a sustainable way. Next slide, please. And just to highlight that, what could be less sustainable than taking meager water supplies, putting them in plastic bottles and selling them to tourists? I love clean water. It makes me feel healthy, but not at the expense of local people's water supplies and livelihoods. Next slide, please. So, we've moved away from pictures and we're going into strategies about this particular program that wanted to really address what was happening with the climate on Soqotra, how that was affecting and relating to cultural heritage on the island, and whether there was any traditional knowledge there that was directly related to or could be adapted to make people aware of and to better manage against what was happening as the climate changes going forward in the future. Just to summarize, and I'll give some more examples in a little bit more detail later. The general perception of climate change is it's going to rain more, it's going to get hotter globally. Yes, there is regional variation, but on Soqotra we really didn't know exactly what that looked like, and actually the background increases in temperature and rainfall are quite difficult to see. They're probably not significant, but the increase in extreme weather events, especially rainfall and tropical storms and cyclones, is most certainly noticeable. It is a small island and the data is a little bit difficult to verify, shall we say, but that's what it looks like to us, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment. As I mentioned before, if the May rains fail, and then there is often reduced rain later in the year, and that really can lead to very, very extreme aridity and drought conditions. There is also a lot of fog on the island and on cliffs in the mountains. A lot of the plants rely on fog to get water, and we understand very little about how fog works. There is no method globally for modeling fog in future climate scenarios. We don't know what's going to happen in 50 years. And that's applicable not just on Soqotra, it's applicable across Arabia and other parts of the world where you have fog deserts and a whole range of fog-dominated habitats. How that affects the cultural heritage, how animals are managed, how water is managed, we simply don't understand. Now, we can do the science on the climate data. That's actually quite easy. What isn't so often done is actually just going to communities and asking what their perception of their local climate is and whether it matches what the data is telling us. The communities here, they notice changes, but they weren't always talking about that in the same way. Instead of saying they thought there were more extreme events, what they said was they felt rain was less reliable and less predictable, and for their way of life as it was, that makes it very, very difficult for them, because they rely on doing things at certain times for certain lengths of time, and if you don't know the rain is there and you can't predict where the plants are going to grow for your animals to graze, it really, really has a direct impact on people's lives. And they have managed that in the past by moving their animals around to areas of water that was more reliable in the face of drought. And that is becoming more and more difficult to do. Next slide, please. So there's some just brief little graphs here to show. You can see on the graph on the left that the increase in rainfall isn't a gradual increase, it is a sporadic and intense increase of particular extreme climate events. It means the average looks like it's going up, but the background average really isn't. It's these extreme events that are increasing in intensity and increasing in frequency as well. The little graph on the bottom right shows that as well. On the top right, what you can see there is the fact that actually the southeast of the island is much, much wetter than the northwest of the island in climate terms. When you look at the map of walls that Julian described earlier, you will see the intensity of the wall system in that area is actually larger, which strongly suggests there is a water management component to those walls. Next slide, please. This is a very quick slide to highlight how science can be misleading. The series of 12 maps on the left shows the global average precipitation over the last 40 years. And you can see a blue map middle left, and also down on the bottom row, that represents your two monsoons, the May and the autumn monsoons. You can see it's wetter at that time of year. But in the set on the right, it's much, much drier with much less rain and much less time of rain just in the later part of the year. And that was a drought period between around the years 2000 to 2006. Unfortunately, many people using climate data for modelling purposes, used data from that to try and make recommendations. And in actual fact, that was the driest period over the last 40 years, and it wasn't representative. So you have to look at the long-term patterns in the past and in the future to really get a robust idea of how science can be used in this way. Next slide, please. And this is just a quick slide to reiterate that the blue lines here represent rainfall, but the orange lines represent rainfall from tropical storms. And you can see again how this is increasing as we move into the last 10 to 15 years, and provides a much bigger proportion of the annual rainfall than was certainly the case in the past. Next slide, please. So that was our first strategy, to try and understand what's happening with the climate. Well, our second strategy is to try and understand how climate is really affecting local communities. And we simply did that by speaking to them. We didn't ask leading questions. We asked them to describe their observations and the effects it had on their lives. It was largely a transhumant society on Soqotra, where grazing animals moved around, and those movements were controlled by grazing so that the animals could access water, and to access water directly, not just through plants. The water wasn't used so much for drinking. The communities themselves relied on the animals for milk, for their and for meat and for wool, and that's a point I'll pick up on in a minute. Many of the water programs that have developed in the last 10 to 20 years that I described earlier have specifically said that they were going to supply water directly to communities, because that meant the communities would no longer need to move their animals around. Again, clean water for communities, great. Clean water for animals, great. Unfortunately, that means the animals don't go anywhere. So in order to feed them, you have to buy food for them. And if in a drought year, you have to buy even more food for them. So what actually happened was that the communities just got into debt. They had clean water, and the animals were like, yeah, great, water will stay here, and you can spend all of your money feeding us. So by the time the communities managed to pay their way out of debt, normally another drought would come along, and it's not a good cycle to get into. If you provide a new water source, there are examples where new villages spring up around the water resource because it's such a valuable resource. If you don't graze the animals and management, you don't manage their reproduction, and the number of goats particularly has increased dramatically, and overgrazing is a problem that's affecting habitats all over Soqotra, which affects the ability of plants to mediate water flow in the soil. So there is a direct habitat effect and a direct water management effect through a lack of grazing. This is not a wild environment, it is a managed environment. But because people can now buy meat and water and other commodities in local markets at cheap prices, would you manage your animals in a difficult way? And this is the animals have less value now than they did 30 years ago. The young people don't want to manage them. They have other priorities. So you can't just go to another country and tell people what to do because you think it looks good, because it looks like conservation. You create a museum that has no value. What needs to have value is the animals. If the animals had value, then the people would manage them in a way that maintained that value. And if that value is no longer meat or milk, are there other values? And fortunately, from our point of view, as Julian mentioned earlier, these animals were used to make carpets, and they used to be a great resource and a value. So if you move to the next slide, please. Our next strategy, having found out what the climate was looking like, having found out how it affected people's lives on a day-by-day and a year-by-year basis, what solutions can we propose and might be viable in this area? Next slide, please. So what mechanisms actually give benefit? So the value of animals, so that they're worth managing in a traditional way that has value in climate adaptation because of the habitat conservation. It'll also bring high quality wool, and therefore if there is a market to sell carpets and related products, that people can, part of their income and livelihoods can be from the animals again, that will bring those traditional management methods back into use. And that was the idea that we had. And that again is where an island system, an isolated system, brings its own challenges. But we considered a whole range of different options. Decreasing animal numbers would be a benefit from returning to traditional management systems, returning to but modifying at the same time. The vegetation, as we've mentioned, will have water management benefits. It's worth spending time with your animals because the wool can lead to manufacture of carpets and other goods that can be sold and contribute to your livelihoods. The traditional knowledge of those traditional crafts is conserved at the same time. There are added values in terms of community well-being and social interactions. Most of the carpets weaving is done by women, and they gather together. They sing songs to the goats and the sheep as they clean them, as they spin the wool. The language is conserved in a community way. That's something doesn't often get looked at the long-term monitoring of benefits of programs of this type. And if there is an income and a livelihood there and a healthy lifestyle, maybe some of the young people won't move away to the big cities or other countries to go and work in other professions. It diversifies the local community's incomes and conserves traditional knowledge and gives the animals value and the knowledge value in a contemporary society which is trying to adapt to a changing climate in an extreme environment. Next slide, please. Of course, understanding the effects of those interventions means you have to go and speak to the communities. This is really very important, and everywhere we go, people telling us, well, yes, you have government stakeholders, and yes, you have local stakeholders, and you have businesses, but you also have communities, and they know about these things. And they are, if you want things to be conserved, and they want to conserve them, they are the people on the ground that are going to do that. Telling them what to do has no value. Asking them what they want going forwards is clearly the way to do things. Now that doesn't sound like rocket science, but it's surprising how often that doesn't happen. And that was one of our big take-home messages. And that wasn't us saying that. It was the communities. It was our partners on Soqotra. When we took our team to other countries to learn from other people's experience, we heard exactly the same story. Speak to the communities, give them things that they value in their lives, and everything else will more or less fall into place. It's not as easy as that, and there are many obstacles to overcome. For example, while Soqotra may not be as isolated as you think, actually getting hundreds of carpets off the island and to markets in Arabia or Europe or other parts of the world isn't that easy to do and is quite expensive to do. And we're still trying to overcome some of those problems as well. Next slide, please. Another strategy we use constantly is to give people on Soqotra a wider experience of ideas of how they can conserve their own heritage and how they can adapt to climate change by showing them examples from other places. And we did this last year by taking them to Jordan. And they spoke to other communities with similar problems, and they made films that they could take back to Soqotra and show to the communities and say, there are other ways to do this. There are similar problems elsewhere that are proposing solutions. You can see at some point I'll be able to share links to these short films and some longer ones we made about our project if people are interested to view more detail. But we met carpet weavers in Jordan. We met fishing communities who had suffered from climate change and increased water flow into their coral areas that were affecting the fish that they were fishing. We spoke to goat herders and cattle herders. We went and visited rock art sites and learnt how the effects of tourism and climate change were having effects to how they manage those sites. And we found that sharing of information to be another critical strategy that really has helped us moving forwards. I am moving now onto my final slide, please. And this just shows an example of some of the protected area systems of Soqotra, of which there are many. What it shows is, firstly, that there are existing, well, the top map, in fact, there are some dots on that map that represent sites that have been surveyed by our team. They are mostly tangible heritage sites. But then you can see blue outlines where they have highlighted areas with a real concentration of heritage that could be incorporated into protected area systems. There are also some smaller sites with pink outlines that are a little difficult to see here, but they represent areas where there are intangible heritage and traditions in particular locations that are still active and still practice and has value. And then in the bottom slide, what I've added on there is some of the biodiversity designations in light blue and light green. And you can see that there is some overlap, but what we're trying to avoid here is such a complicated system of sites for diversity and for heritage that it becomes impossible to manage locally. And we are now discussing again with everyone, with communities that manage and live by these sites and benefit from them, with local experts, with local government stakeholders, with national government stakeholders, of how best not just to manage the sites for the future, but to adapt to climate change in the future, but more importantly, how to make sure that they have the resources and capacity to do those things and the connections to learn from other people who have had similar problems. That's an area of my research interest that will, I'm sure, keep me busy for a long time. Sorry, final slide, please. That's just a screenshot from a film that we made, which I hope will be released in the very near future, showing one of our team sitting on Soqotra, and just showing the dedication that team, the love they have for their heritage, is what drives us on to try and help them protect it in the face of uncertainty, and long may that continue. Thank you very much for your time listening, and I'm sure myself and Julian will be delighted to hear any of your comments and try to answer any of your questions. Thank you very much.
Dr. Alan and Julian, that was great, wasn't it, Paul? I mean, I've made so many notes, but we have a few questions, but I just wanted to make some comments that I think, although it seems so unlike Brazil, because we're talking about an island in the Middle East, and it is so like Brazil in so many ways. I mean, a few things you said. First of all, the uniqueness of its biodiversity and how, you know, you have islands within countries as well. And Brazil is a continental country with many different bio islands, if you can call that a biodiversity islands, and cultural as well. So we have this natural abundance, like you can see in Soqotra, which, by the way, I was so amazed by, you know, the dragon tree, the cucumber tree is all very amazing and beautiful. And as you said, it's a shame that Darwin never went there, because probably he would have discovered many things. But I think the thing that, and also in Brazil, we do have protected areas, biodiversity protected areas, which I think create islands as well within Brazil. And but I think what resonates and what for me was very special of your presentation is that it's impossible to separate biodiversity from cultural and social traditions and knowledge. When you start to do that, then you don't, first of all, you just don't understand how everything works. You either look at the people, yeah, as Julian was saying, that at the beginning there's no pictures of people, it's just pictures of plants. But then when you start to separate, you lose in both ends, because you can't understand the people and separate them from their traditional knowledge. And I think that, and also the biodiversity from what these communities, how they operate within these biodiversities. And I think that really resonates with Brazil. And when you started talking about the cave, Paul, I'm sure you remember that as well. People's Palace Project has this amazing project with the indigenous communities in Brazil, in the center of Brazil. And they have this sacred cave, but the sacred cave, for some reason, was kept out of the protected area. So, the protected area by the government sort of split the actual... So they have this protected reserve for the indigenous people, but their sacred cave is outside, and the cave was looted. It was awful.
Yeah.
The same is true for
for
that cave. Yeah, that cave,
exactly.
Hock Cave, falls about 500 meters outside the boundary of what they call the nature sanctuary at Hom Hill, isn't it? And I'm literally this week redrawing a line on a map so that the cave is included in that site. It's easy to say this, but it makes no sense why you would do it that way. But we've been keeping those things separate for a long time, conceptually and institutionally. And that's not to say that the large global organizations now recognize this, and we're starting to bring these things back together. This is highlighted on Soqotra before Soqotra opened up in the early 90s. And Yemen was becoming more settled as a country. People went to Soqotra, and the way that we use the word environment post Rio Convention in 1992, there was no word that was the same as environment in the Soqotri language until we went there and taught them it, because they didn't recognize it as something separate.
That is amazing.
I think this is one of the things that's been nice, as an archaeologist, going on about cultural heritage and then teaming together with a botanist, and then the two of us coming together and going, what's going on? And it's sort of it's quite amusing. We hit each other and we're like, oh, what about this? And he's like, oh, what about plants? And it's like, well, move them aside. And after a while, we just realized as well, and all these interviews in the start, it's like, wait a minute, what's going on here? Why is no one talking? Because no one seems to see the difference. Quite often, especially on the team on the island, even today, they're putting things on Facebook. They're recognizing their traditions, especially like the walls. They're like, look, we're losing all the soil. Look, the wall's gone. Why have we destroyed that wall? Oh, because someone wanted to build a road. But look, it's killing our soil. And they start to see these things actually occurring now. And then they're like, oh, wow, actually, they had a point. In the past, this is why. And it slowly starts to come that, and you start to just sort of make people aware. And I think quite clearly, a lot of this is awareness, awareness of stakeholders, both, people who are living on the ground and those people drawing lines on a piece of paper, It's always these people drawing lines on a paper that seem to lack the awareness of where the lines should be. The caves is a classic point in case, just because someone thought there's a line.
Exactly.
It doesn't work.
Yeah. And as UK citizens, we recognise how we've done that in history and how we shouldn't have done that in history.
But it feels so logical, the points that you raise as well, that, you have to listen to the community. Obviously, you're working with them. And it's an integrated and collaborative learning in the complete sense. So you're joining environment and culture, but you're also learning from each other, and and learning from the community, and sharing experiences and knowledge as well with other places, which I think that really relates to us, because there's so much we can learn from that in Brazil, because we do. There's something, I think that was Alan that said that, or I can't remember, it was Alan or Gillian, that there are certain sites that are not recognized or recorded yet in Brazil still, at least not as they should be in terms of their importance in, be it cultural diversity, tangible or intangible, or even because there's this look, especially I think Julian mentioned the Amazon. Obviously the Amazon is this amazing environment that everyone is looking at, but what about all the communities that live there, and all about the cultural traditions they have there, and how do they relate to that territory? So I was very happy. There are a few questions here. I'm going to try and put the questions together so that we can move more quickly. But one thing that came up, and this is like, I just wanted to jump to the end now, because, well, to the end of Julian's presentation, because he brought up poetry. And I, for me, that was beautiful, because I think poetry is very political. Usually, even if it's talking about love, it's sort of, it's representing a way of looking to the world. So if you're writing your own poetry, there's something about how you see yourself in that world and how you recognize the world around you. And it's very straightforward because it's said. So there's something about oral traditions as well, which is really strong in Brazil, especially in the indigenous communities. And I love that you said that the poetry sort of helps us document the changes in the traditions and what is going on in society at that point. But we saw only pictures of men. Do women do poetry in Soqotra as well? And how is the relationship with women in that sense?
Okay, yes, but don't forget where you are. So I can't photograph them and I wouldn't show them, but there are some very, very strong woman poets. And I've had the fortune to be in one of these sort of poem slams where you have the men and the women also there. And yeah, I think it was at that one of these competitions where the women actually were winning, and they were starting to be very strong against the man about, hey, you're not doing this, and your poetry is not as good as ours, and they couldn't win, so it started to get a bit too heated, and eventually they just said, okay, we're done, get out. And it was very amusing. But yes, the women are very strong and very good poets as well. You just don't hear much about them, and there is a male dominance, but the women are just as strong poets, and they do have some amazing poetry too. So yes, very much so. Just I wouldn't show a picture of them because I can't. I wouldn't photograph them.
Yeah, well, yeah, fair enough. It's a different culture, as I said. It's completely different from Brazil in certain perspectives, especially in that sense. But in saying so, in most indigenous traditions as well, where oral tradition is very strong, the men usually is important. That sort of tells the stories. But now we have women. There are loads of slam poetry's only women participating, and especially sort of women's voices are raising in that sense as well here, even though you can take pictures of the women. We're still sort of finding this balance between how much women can express themselves. But going back to the actual complexities of the project, we were wondering, because a few questions came up about, first, how was the initial approach to the community, how the community reacted to this approach? So, funding, international funding coming and trying to understand this. But also, I think I could ask together with that, were there or are there any contradictions between development and preservation? So how do you operate between exactly that? So they want a road, and how important is that road? But that road is crossing, this rock art site. So how do you sort of manage that, this duality between development and preservation, and how was the approach to the community, and how that still continues?
In my opinion, as with a complex situation and a complex question, that's quite a complex answer as well. So I'll try and keep it as simple as possible in the interest of time. The easy way to get around a question like that is saying, how do we manage, how did we approach the communities? So personally, I've always taken the view that whatever the local community wants to do is actually the right way forward. If it's their heritage, it's their island, they're the custodians of their landscapes and their biodiversity. If they want to build a road through it, all you can do is say that might not be a good idea, but if that's what they want to do, on you go, because we have no right to go and tell them what, and that has happened in the past. In terms of managing and expectations of external funding, again, that's become a problem because many of the programs that are run on Soqotra are dependent on external funding. There is not really any sustainable financing on Soqotra, or more widely in Yemen. The funding the Yemen authorities have for their own people on Soqotra is virtually zero. So in that way, the communities and the stakeholders on Soqotra are very used to having external programs and other people coming and working with them. And that's both positive and negative, because it's good to have the resources, but it's not good to become dependent on the resources, because dependence on external resources means you can be easily influenced. You have to remember that Yemen is a very poor country in conflict, and Soqotra is the poorest part of it. So they're in no position to say, we don't want your money and your resources. That's not an easy thing for them to say. The third answer I would give in terms of how to contact the communities and engage with them, but the first thing we did was establish a local team. Okay, we've come to the point now where so I'll give you the big admission. I have never visited the island of Soqotra. I would love to go there as a tourist and see how amazing it is, but again, with an acceptance of my country's colonial past, can I trust myself to go there and then not just do the work or tell people what to do? I probably could, but I'm happy to not go there every year and say and do that kind of stuff. So we established a local team who are committed and interested. They're already embedded in the communities because that's their communities. So that wasn't really a question. We just let the local guys get on with it. And when they need additional or want additional skills and support, that's where myself and Julian step in. Julian, however, has an additional point.
Yeah, no, I have a few points, but yeah, I think it was key in the beginning of this project, and many of the beginning of this sort of whole thing 6 years ago. Our first thing was to find women and men to set up a group of people who were dedicated to their own culture and to the records head. And it wasn't a matter of looking for someone. They were interested. They wanted to do it. They just didn't know how, or have the funds or the means, or even understood the best way to go about it. Providing them with just a little bit of training on how to conduct an interview, how to do something, or what to record it, how best they've gone from that and they've run away with it. You know, I used to laugh at them. So you got to start crawling before you can walk. And at the moment they're flying. You know, it's you've seen a group of people go from, you know, crawling and they're flying away. They've created their own foundation and everything. But going back to the idea of the communities, one thing has come across, and while I do go out there quite, I have various other archaeological projects I'm running, but one of the things that come out quite clearly is awareness. And I think awareness is key, and that's why we always take out school children. I always go and do a little walk around the island, and I talk to the people, and I try to do presentations all the time. And I take, you know, obviously I'm not always the one doing it, or I'll get my team and they've been working with me. I say, okay, let's go to the next villages, talk about what we did. You know, I'll just sit there with a mouthful of teeth and they'll tell everyone in Soqotri what they were doing, why we did it, what's important about the site. And then, like one of the first protected site in the island in 2019, it's got a very strange name, SHP-067, because no one can pronounce the Soqotri name on it except the local Soqotris. And the actual name on the island means flat rock. And that it wasn't that. The guy said to me, Julian, I'm really interested in the site. It's a rock art site. It needs to be protected. They're going to build a house on it. I was like, yeah, but you need to go and do something about it. Speak to the governor, and they did. And months later, they set up that with some help, obviously, they set up the first and only yet protected cultural heritage protected site in the island. And that's what I mean. Awareness and setting up a group on the island who do the work for you, essentially. Sorry.
Yeah. No, we've now got to the point after 5 or 6 years where we routinely say to other people that ask about the project that the team on the island do their best work when we're not involved. That we, instead of us saying, here's a project, here are the components of the project, here are the skills you'll need, we're just getting links on social media saying, we did this, we did that, we did this. So it's completely flipped around in quite a short period of time. If we can just get that sustainable financing mechanism, we could almost walk away entirely. And that's the end goal, right? That they don't need our help anymore because they're just so good at doing it themselves.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge, isn't it? Securing financing everywhere in Brazil as well. Sustainable financing. Yeah,
it's such a great point to finish on, really, in terms of how this project inspires us. I think inspires so many people that I know over the 2 or 3 years I've been hearing Alan talk about it. It is a completely inspiring project. And it's interesting, Alan, that you finished with those wonderful examples of the exchange of learning, I think with Jordan and with other countries. I thought that was just exemplary as well. The way in which, the problems can't be solved all in that island, but they can be solved by other people who are sharing similar problems. And therefore, also, I think with that, your use of film and the way in which you're sort of encouraging that the film has a crucial role to play in preservation. And it's not an alien form. It's one that can be actually a tool, perhaps rather than a form, that you've used so brilliantly on this project. And I think that all those videos that you've shown us and that you've indicated to us are things that we want to go away and look at and to work from, but also just to think about that exchange that is possible. First of all, the exchange between the two of you is in different forms between the botanist and the archaeologist, but also that incredible exchange that you've instigated. And it could be that it's financial and that's what you want. I know that it's part of a marketplace, but it's also that exchange about just ways of life and ways of living. So thank you so much, both of you. It's been such a privilege to spend an hour and a half on Soqotra with the two of you.
Yeah, it has been amazing. Thank you so much. We had more questions, but we didn't have time. But yeah, it's left us thinking about so many resonances with Brazil and also with exchange, and how we can exchange knowledge and share teachings about.
I think this. If anyone wants additional questions or wants to be pointed towards more information about our project or Soqotra and or wider regional initiatives, we're not difficult to find online. So it's either through our institutes or websites and different areas. And as a follow up to this, we can happily share links to some of our resources as well, if that would be interesting for people.
Thank you.
That is great. Thank you. Thank you. I think that's it for today. Thank you very much. So our conversation will be online for whoever missed it. So we can, you can share the YouTube link as well. Anyone that feels they are interested, and we'll be here again next Tuesday with more on climate change and cultural heritage. And and thank you very much for viewing and for being with us. Dr. Alan and Dr. Julian and Paul, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.